Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Don Doyle, and we're going to get into Don's work, particularly around his 2014 book, The Cause of All Nations, An International History of the American Civil War. And we're going to talk about the ideas around that. Don, thanks so much for joining us. I was hoping that you could introduce yourself, including what led you to write The Cause of All Nations.
Thanks very much, Luke. I'm glad to be here. Um, this book began a long time ago. I had done a lot of other studies, primarily focused on the South and on kind of micro historical subjects, community studies and cities and so on. Um, I took a Fulbright professorship over in Italy one time, and I heard someone talking about how the U.S. had tried to enlist Giuseppe Garibaldi, the great hero of the Italian Risorgimento, to not only fight for the Union Army, but to lead the Union Army. And I was fascinated by that story. I tracked it down later, and that became the opening chapter for the book. I called it Garibaldi's Question. Um, I was just by that time, and partly due to my Fulbright experience in Italy and uh, living abroad in England and elsewhere, I just became fascinated with the idea that the American Civil War had a much larger boundaries. I remember reading David Potter back in the 1960s when we were going through the centenary of the Civil War. And he complained that the American Civil War still just remained a kind of self-absorbed story about America's war, fought on American soil, about issues that were peculiarly American. And he and others tried to broaden the framework, but it really never happened. And the diplomatic history was rich and very well done, but that focuses mainly on government to government decisions and on strategy and kind of deals with the material interests of nations. I was curious about, again, this idea that Garibaldi might be recruited and why did they bother with that? Why did the Union approach him? They sent a special envoy over to his home in Caprera and tried to induce him to come over and fight. Um, why would they do that? Well, it was all about the effort to block the recognition by European powers, primarily Britain or France, to recognize the Confederacy. Now, recognition is the key. It's not just a minor thing, it's everything. About half of our world's nations today had their beginnings, including the United States, as a breakaway state. And so it's a very common path to nationhood and sovereignty. The South was one of the notable exceptions to that. Why did that happen? Why did they become stigmatized, apparently by slavery and not just by rebellion itself, because that was, as I say, a normal pathway to nationhood. And so I wanted to understand what was the foreign opinion like? What did people like Garibaldi and the Italians, how did they relate to the Civil War? Governments in a monarchy like Britain, the decisions are made in Parliament, not at the throne, but by Parliament. But they have to answer to the people. And so popular opinion was very important in all of this. In France, the other major power involved in this, Napoleon III was a dictator. He rarely convened Parliament and didn't give them much chance to question his policies. But nonetheless, a dictator, they don't lose elections. They lose their heads if they don't have the support of the people. And so Napoleon was very aware of the role that the American War came to play for the opposition to his regime, the Second Empire. And so I wanted to follow that. I wanted to find out what the foreign public thought, what they wrote about, why they attached so much meaning to the Civil War. And then I became fascinated by the fact that over 40% of the Union soldiers were either immigrants or the sons of immigrants. And that was remarkable. They never could have won without the immigrants. And I wanted to know about them and why they fought And so it soon fell into place that this was a story about what they saw as an international civil war, and not just over sovereignty or secession or even over slavery. It was much more than that.
It's interesting to hear that your interest started with Garibaldi. That's fun because you're right. Your book, of course, does start with his story, and he comes back into the story at various times. He's a nice sort of foundation, if you will, that the story gets big and very expansive and then comes back to him, and it works because he's very central to this history. As your book makes clear, the Civil War was an international event and was understood as such by the actors in that story. I was thinking we could start with diplomacy because, as you note, the war involved an immense amount of what you call public diplomacy. And so I was curious how the North and South sold their story of the war to the rest of the world, and also how that story changed or how particular aspects got emphasized or de emphasized over time.
Yes, that's a good question. It's absolutely central to my book, but also to the war. Again, recognition was the main prize here. The North wanted to do everything they could to deny recognition, and they would threaten war. And their main argument was that this is a domestic insurrection. We are calling out the army because it's larger than we can control without that. But this is not an international war. It's none of your business. Britain and France or Spain, you stay out of this. And if you do try to come in, we will consider it, quote, an unfriendly act. They made the argument that secession was unconstitutional and that this was more than just a voluntary compact among states. This was a nation, and nations live forever. You don't just change your mind if you don't like who was elected. This is a democracy and a permanent nation, a perpetual union. The North said that slavery is not the issue. We're not, Lincoln didn't run on the promise that he would abolish slavery. They're going to limit its expansion. But slavery is not at issue in the states where it already exists. The South agreed. They said we're not fighting for slavery. Slavery has been safe. It's been protected by the Constitution. We are fighting for our independence, self-determination as a nation, just as our forefathers did. The Constitution has served us well until now, and now we are withdrawing from this voluntary compact because it no longer serves our interests. And of course, everything that they listed under the grievances in their initial declarations of secession, state by state, had to do with slavery. But when the foreign envoys were sent over, the diplomats from the South, they were carefully instructed, do not make this a war to defend slavery. And they rehearsed the arguments that slavery had always been accorded a place in the Constitution and that it was safeguarded. They were fighting for differences over tariffs. And of course, that was a way of promising Europe that if we win, you will not have to pay tariffs to get cotton to and to bring in imported goods into the South, into the independent Confederacy. And they continued to say, just change the subject when they bring up slavery. And so that was the way it began.
That question of slavery and what is the war about, as I understand it, became pretty essential that the North positioned slavery at the center of the struggle as it was, and that was uh, perhaps we could say decisive in ensuring the non-recognition maybe of the South.
Yes, the Union made sure that it would be very painful and very inconvenient to take sides with slavery. And what they were doing, going down a little farther down the road, is Lincoln, Seward, and especially the diplomats overseas in in Italy and France, in England, they were telling Seward and the Secretary of State and Lincoln, foreigners want this to be a war against slavery. They don't want it just to be about sovereignty and territory. The first hint of this was Garibaldi's question when they went over there in September 1861 and negotiated with him to come over to the fight for the Union. He said, "What are you fighting about? If this is just a war over territory and secession and so on, people will have no moral stake in it. They won't care. But if it's to emancipate the slaves, I'll be there. Bring it on." He was glad to raise his sword for a cause that was worthy. That gained traction and is really the way I look at it is kind of foreigners, not all foreigners, but liberal foreigners, workers and students and others. They're telling Americans, here's what your war is about or ought to be about. And the Union kind of nodding its head and realize, okay, we're going to make this more than just a war over the legality of secession.
People from all over the world fought for both sides, but the Union, it sounds like, had the most prominent contingent of international troops. And there's a great example that you have in the book, a recruitment poster for the Garibaldi Guard of the New York 39th Infantry. Patrioti Italiani, Havendek, Amis de la Liberté, Deutsch, Freies, Kampfheer. The aid of every man is required for the service of the adopted country. So, as I butchered all those other languages, Italians, Hungarians, Germans, and French, patriots of all nations, arouse, arouse, arouse. So that's the advertisement that's being used to attract troops. And, of course, this gives us some idea of who was involved. But if not Americans, and we shouldn't forget the many former enslaved people who would also end up fighting for the Union. But if not Americans, who were the people who were fighting to end slavery, and why did they fight? Why did they come?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, the South portrayed them as mercenaries from the dregs of Europe. The failures, the social discontents, the radical socialists, and so on, that Europe didn't want, and they came over and fought the war. They were mercenaries, soldiers of fortune. Good riddance to them. They would tell the aristocracy of Europe. But it's clear that many of them were already in America. They'd come over after the Revolution of 1848, which failed across most of Europe, and it's a big wave of immigration. They and their sons were coming to the war, some of them with military experience, especially those from Germany, willing and ready to fight the war that they or their parents had lost in the old country. And it was for the liberal state, for the idea of equality and justice for all. Very simple, basic rules, representative government, but anti-aristocracy first and foremost, anti-slavery right along with that. The slave-holding aristocracy and the aristocracy of Europe were kind of conflated in their minds. I was aided in my research by just wonderful letters that were written by Irish and German soldiers, uh, more of them than of the French. Walter Kempenhofer co-edited a wonderful volume of letters from German soldiers. And some of them are just saying, I'm in this war. They, nothing important, but a lot of them use that occasion to testify to their parents, to their wives, to others back home. This is why I'm fighting. And it's beautiful, very eloquent. They were zealous. These were soldiers of conviction, not of fortune.
I think even at one point saying the North has this campaign of kidnapping people,
Yes.
offering them money,
Yeah.
just trying to delegitimize the entire process.
Yes.
And then the failed revolutions of 1848 is another very important moment. I've spoken with other folks about how people, the 48ers, come to the US, and many of them end up fighting in the Civil War for the Union, many of them from Germany, other places. Reading this book made it clear made me think how there's this aspect of trying to realize the ideals or fighting for the ideas perhaps that were defeated in Europe in 48 and seeing another battleground or sort of a continuation of that struggle here in America.
And I finished the the book with a, a kind of panoramic view of the effects of this democratic, abolitionist, Republican victory in America, tracing the impact in Britain with the Reform Act and Karl Marx cheering on Lincoln and amazed at the revolutionary power of democracy and electoral politics in Spain, which becomes a kind of the vanguard of European democracy in 1868 and throws out the Queen Isabella and establishes a democratic society. It was short-lived, but very radical. And then, of course, France, which finally overthrows Napoleon III in 1870. So it's a new day for democracy, which was beleaguered on the ropes in very rare in Europe and elsewhere. And not only in Europe, but in Latin America. The United States had come to protect Latin America, not materially until after the war, but it stood up using the Monroe Doctrine, which we often think of as kind of a foil for U.S. imperialism. It was much more a pact, a kind of pan-American pact, and a promise to make the American hemisphere a haven for republics.
You include Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and a line that Lincoln says, a very memorable line: "A government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." And it occurred to me that I had read that line, and especially that last bit, "shall not perish from the earth," as specifically talking about the US and saying, okay, the US or the North will win this war, and therefore the world won't be deprived of a Republican form of government, which could be true. But I also found myself thinking, well, is he also talking about just republicanism in general, this kind of global project? And it sounds like he is. There's this understanding. I'm basically just confirming everything you've said, but there's this understanding of it's not just the US versus, excuse me, the North versus the South. It is, in some ways, monarchism versus republicanism, and that's a global struggle.
Whether whatever Lincoln intended, both meanings were available to people who read that speech generations hence. And he begins with another little phrase that tips that off. It says, so that this nation or any nation so conceived in liberty and the idea of equality. And so he universalizes the struggle. And that was really I think, a moment that defined how the Union had embraced this notion that earlier they had discarded and resisted, that this was about some larger issues of slavery and emancipation and freedom for all. They embraced that. They made it, and they made it their own. But they also made it not just the cause of the United States, but the cause of all nations, to coin a phrase.
So there's this labor question here as well, this question of free labor, as it's referred to, versus enslaved labor. Certainly not everyone involved in the struggle was a socialist, though some of the fighters were. But it occurred to me that perhaps Karl Marx was not alone in seeing the Civil War as the cutting edge of a global proletarian struggle, that this had a working class character to it. And of course, you have Marx's famous phrase of the laborer can't be emancipated so long as it's enslaved in black skin, to paraphrase him. what was this free labor versus enslaved labor discussion like?
No one is more articulate on that than Karl Marx, who watched the Civil War uh, with keen interest. He was writing for the New York Tribune and paying his rent with weekly articles that he gave. And he was convinced from the beginning that no matter what each side said, this war is about slavery, about the slaveholding aristocracy. He described the South as kind of the last bastion of an old feudal aristocracy based in land and the control of labor. He marveled at Lincoln and at the power, the revolutionary power of democracy and electoral politics. And I argued in my sequel to this book that Marx becomes, at least briefly, a democratic socialist. And he sees this as a great victory for the emancipation of labor. And, 4 million men who are not even not considered humans, that is of equal standing, who suddenly are not just emancipated, but who are enfranchised, who are brought to full citizenship and then given the vote. This was a really radical movement that I don't think anyone had foreseen at the outset of the war. And Marx was very enthusiastic about it. As the war is coming to a close, he organizes International Workingmen's Party, the first international, as communists call it, in 1864. And they, in turn, the first international sponsors the Reform League, a kind of coalition of middle class and working class British people fighting for the right to vote. And so he wants to enfranchise more voters and follow the path toward democracy and workers' power through electoral politics.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about how the Chartist movement in Britain, well, they sort of die down a bit earlier than when the Civil War starts, but you have them, as I understand, sort of in their high point in the late 30s, early 1840s. You have this 1848 period demands for some kind of constitution in these European countries of various democratic flavors. And then you have this continuation into the Civil War in the United States. And then Reconstruction, of course, in the US.
And historians have usually described the age of democratic revolutions as something that begins in the Americas in the 1770s and then dies out in 1848. It's crushed. Um, but I instead think that we better understand the Age of Revolutions as a transatlantic movement that continues, not always successfully, but with setbacks, and continues on up into about 1870, where that liberal reform, democratic reform impulse begins to divide between socialists and liberal Democrats. The Chartists, to go back to Britain, their movement had died out, but there were a lot of veterans who were still there, and they were very caught up in the pro-union movement during the war, and then in the Reform League that was organized just at the end of the war, has its inaugural meeting in 1865. But more importantly, the Chartist way of demonstrating was revived. If you don't have the vote, you can't just, get out the vote on election day. They were disfranchised. So what did they do? They marched five abreast with drums and flags and singing through the streets of London and Birmingham and other industrial cities to demonstrate their strength in numbers. And that's what finally, it caused tremendous fear throughout England among the aristocracy. I mean, many thought they were on the verge of an armed revolution. And that's when Parliament kind of broke its resistance and enacted the Second Reform Act, which doubled the number that could vote and enfranchised most, not all, of the working class.
Supportive or pro union, anti slavery ideas are coming from other countries. I think in your book, and we're going to get to Mexico and Latin America in a moment because that's a big part. But for now, Britain, France, and being translated into English. So, for example, you have a great bit on Mary Louise Booth, who translates French pro unionist voices into English. Charles Sumner, I note here, says that the book she wrote, which was translated into The Uprising of a Great People, was worth a whole phalanx in the cause of human freedom. And then you also have pro Republican unionist voices that are coming over to France and other countries in Europe and aiding anti monarchical struggles.
I call that chapter translations. And they're translating it from French. It was Gasparine's famous appeal to the Union, the uprising of a great people. And at first glance, you might think this was a Frenchman applauding the uprising of the Confederacy. No, he saw the crisis as a breakthrough for the Union and for democracy in America, and that it would finally bring to a head this nagging question of slavery that was impeding the progress of democracy and human progress in America. It was a real zesty, spirited call to arms, and not just in America, but in Europe. They need friends. They need our help. Now is the time, Gasparine told him. Mary Louise Booth was one of the unsung heroes, in my view, of the American Civil War and of this whole process of public diplomacy and making people understand the war in a new way. She was a historian, by the way, and she wrote a wonderful history of New York that was a bestseller. She was planning to travel around the world and do similar studies of Paris and London and so on. But that was not to be. She raised her pen, not her sword, but her pen on behalf of the Union and translated that very quickly, got it to print within a couple of weeks, and it became a fast-selling book. And here, the way I see it is these are foreigners through the good offices of Mary Louise Booth telling Americans, here's what your war is about. Here's what we think it's about. Here's what it ought to be about. And if it is, we're on your side. There's a chorus of U.S. diplomats and foreign liberals writing to Lincoln, to Seward, and telling him the same thing, that we're with you if you make this war something more, if you elevate this war to a higher moral plane. She played a very important role in this kind of public diplomacy pressuring Lincoln administration to move forward and make this war something more. You don't have that with the South. There are foreign translators, James Spence in Britain, who writes a powerful defense of the Confederacy, went through several editions, and it's essentially an attack on democracy in the North. Democracy run amok, being controlled by the mob, and that the South was composed of, a higher race, Anglo-Saxons, and that they were the side for Europeans to take. And then some of the Confederacy began writing their own uh, propaganda, publishing it and distributing it in France and England. And they were trying the same thing. They were also experimenting in public diplomacy and trying to win public favor. But again and again, the fact that they were fighting, that it was not just that they were a revolutionary state trying to gain independence that happened to have slavery. The reason that they wanted independence was to protect slavery. That was their reason for being. And that was the argument that the Union tacked on to the Confederacy. And that was in bad odor in England, which took great pride in its anti-slavery tradition, and in France, that had thought slavery is done with. It's dead. It's a barbaric relic of the past.
They also, at least for a period, succeed or attempt to tack on the idea of monarchism. that the South would be interested in in restoring some sort of monarchical system.
Hmm. Yes, and so the South appeals to Southern envoys like John Slidell and uh, and Mason, James Mason in London, Slidell in Paris, Edwin de Leon in Europe. They argued that this is kind of the last bastion of a government based on uh, the superior class, the rule by the superior class, and a bulwark against mobocracy. The South was appealing to kind of deeply ingrained prejudices against popular suffrage, universal suffrage, excessive democracy, and radicalism of all kinds. So, they were making an argument that reinforced this notion of a battle between monarchists and republicans. The textbook approach to this is, they begin comparing North and South, population, industrial might, the kind of the material basis for war, better generals, all of the arguments that you have. But a civil war like this, the breakaway state, they don't have to win. They just have to stave off losing and hope for third party intervention, Britain or France to come in. And they would come in because of their material interests in getting cotton without tariffs, and because it was also a way of dividing what might become, wasn't then, but might become a great power in the Western Hemisphere, divide them up, create a balance of power. So there was a lot of strategy on the side of Europe. My view was that this was all up for grabs, that there was no reason that to expect the Union would prevail inevitably. I was talk about Southerners shirking the draft and so on. They served at a much higher level than the Union population did. The Union was helped out tremendously by foreign immigrants and by emancipated blacks in the North and self-emancipated blacks in the South. And without them, they might not have made it. But there was also this ideological energy that I think not only motivated and enlivened the Union troops and helped to mitigate the demoralization of this long, bloody war at home, but it also made intervention on behalf of the South very unsavory in Europe. And so there was a kind of moral, ideological battle that was being contested in world opinion that the Union won.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even the discussion around win, lose, how, why that we're usually presented with doesn't bring in the question of other countries. And it lacks, to your point as well, that drive of moral ideas, which really comes across, folks who read the book will see, but really comes across in how important that is, especially for international perspective.
It meant that uh, the Palmerston regime in Britain or Napoleon III in France, it meant that they would pay a large price for siding with the South, a price of strengthening the opposition, and just a kind of soiling of their reputation, especially for Britain as the champion of anti-slavery and the champion of the closing down the slave trade, for example. In the summer of 1862, when Lincoln has decided that he's going to launch the Emancipation Proclamation. And he's worried, of course, that Britain is going to intervene or France. Under international law at the time, that if third parties come together and offer to mediate peace, and one of the nations says yes and the other says no, then third party nations can come in and side with the party that accepted their mediation. Very dangerous. And Palmerston and his second in the Lord, John Russell, they decided that they were going to put this before the cabinet and decide on whether or not to intervene. And in the meantime, William Gladstone is kind of bidding for to become the next prime minister, is out making speeches and announcing that the South has built a navy and an army and they deserve our recognition. Kind of a trial balloon. And this is exactly at the time that Lincoln has issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and the news of that is coming across the ocean. And Garibaldi shows up with a wonderful appeal to Britain in the Times. Stand by your daughter, America, who is now struggling to defeat those traitors in human flesh. And it's a short letter, but it just underscores kind of the political cost that the British government will pay. There were also material interests. I mean, it's not a good idea to get involved in a land war in America. The British had learned in the Revolution and in the War of 1812. And the cabinet met for a long time and they decided to scotch the idea.
Well, let's turn to Mexico and Latin America. There's a lot of talk about the Monroe Doctrine these days, and as you point out, the doctrine was initially seen in Latin America as a means by which the U.S. might keep out the former colonial powers of Europe. The story of the U.S. then becoming its own power and everything else it does, that's another story. But there's at least this idea of, okay, here's a force that will keep out the former conquerors, the former imperial powers. But with the U.S. distracted with the war, these former powers start making eyes, and more than just eyes. The French, the British, the Spanish, they invade Mexico in 1862. I noted this great little addition you have of when the Spanish arrived in Veracruz in December 1861. The commander makes a speech harkening back to Hernan Cortez's arrival, more than 350 years ago. So there's this real one. It's a little funny because, as you note, Cortez ordered the ships burned so that the folks couldn't return home. But it's a wonderful example of how people are seeing their actions as connected to historical struggles and longer historical processes. We are returning here to this place where we once were, so on and so forth.
The Europeans were like vultures. As soon as the war, and in fact, even before the war broke out, Spain launched an attack on the former Dominican Republic, um, overthrew the government, and annexed the Dominican Republic into the Spanish Empire. It began a long civil war in the Dominican Republic, and it failed. But it was the first sign that the Europeans were going to take every advantage that they could of America's distraction, as they put it. This is when William Seward told Lincoln in his famous April 1st memo to Lincoln, we have to declare a war against Spain and perhaps France too, and that'll unite our country. And every historian has used that as kind of a way of belittling Seward for his preposterous proposal. But Seward was right. If they were allowed to come in and take over the Dominican Republic, they would go further. And later the same year, they met in October over in London, Spain, France, and Britain, and signed a tripartite uh, alliance. And they led by December, an Allied invasion of Mexico, supposedly to collect debts. But the French, they had every intention of toppling this Republican regime, now led by Benito Juarez, and to installing a European monarch in place of him, and creating in Mexico a kind of model of monarchy and stability that would supplant the Latin failed Latin experiments in self-government. Spain and Britain both dropped out. They pulled out because they didn't want regime change and they didn't want empire. And they sure as hell didn't want to help the French take an empire back in Mexico. But Spain launches an armada that goes down to South America and tries to intimidate them and occupies the Chincha Islands of Peru and starts a war there, and then goes down to Chile and bombards Valparaiso. So they're out to reassert the Spanish authority over their former colonies in South America. Maybe not create an empire, but I think they were headed in that direction. And France too was setting up something that where Latin America would become a kind of under the control of European empires and of Catholicism and of monarchy and a bulwark against Anglo-Saxon republicanism, which they thought was infecting and ruining Latin America.
Reading this section, I was thinking of the historian Manisha Sinha's newer book on Reconstruction, which she brings all the way up to 1919, basically to include the development of U.S. overseas interests, U.S. involvement in the Philippines, in Cuba, defeating Spain and pushing them out of that part of the world towards the end of the 19th century. And so the Civil War is over, but again, seeing how these things are connected. The European powers have returned during the Civil War. The U.S., the North wins the Civil War. There's Reconstruction.
In the sequel to Cause of All Nations, The Age of Reconstruction that I wrote is kind of to expand that final chapter. I showed that there was, after the Union victory, a sudden exodus of European empires. France pulls out of Mexico in March 1867. Russia sells Alaska at the end of the same month. And Britain proclaims the Dominion of Canada at exactly the same time. And on April 1st of 1867, Spain finally agrees to allow the U.S. to mediate peace in its war with Peru, Chile, and now Bolivia. The Cubans rise up the next year in 1868, proclaiming independence. Puerto Rico also. And that was a war that was kind of an unfinished revolution, to borrow a phrase, in overthrowing the Spanish presence in the Western Hemisphere. So it was an infectious, contagious spread of anti-imperialism, abolition. Spain ended slavery in 1870 or put it on the road to extinction. And just a lot of democratic energy exploding, not just in America, but in Latin America and in Western Europe.
I must say, I feel a little silly that I haven't read your follow up to this book so that I can follow the conversation.
I'll
Just
come
the
back if you want,
Oh,
Lou.
that would be lovely when we have more time, because as folks will surely have heard, it's really interesting to see how these different events fit together. This is just the process of learning history, I suppose. You see how different events come together.
Yes, it's an interconnected world in which a tremor over here in one corner of the web sends tremors throughout the network and causes trends. They don't necessarily cause, but they influence and stimulate trends in one country after another. So abolition doesn't just happen, for example, in one country and then another. It happens because of growing pressure, international pressure to end slavery, and moral pressure within and between nations.
The North wins the Civil War. What impact does that victory have for struggles for Republican forms of government across the world? Is it a shot of confidence in the arm? Is it what does it do?
Yes, I think it definitely was. And the results were immediate. First in the withdrawal of European empires, but also in their collapse in Spain, in France, in Rome. The Pope, he didn't have imperialist armies, but he was had a major place in kind of shoring up and giving kind of his spiritual blessings to the old regime. and the old regime was now on its back feet. The victory in North America, in the United States, it really was a blow to that old regime of church and crown. And um, even in those democracies, uh, like like Britain, that remained monarchical, democracy was on the ascendant. People wanted the vote. Before 1860 and the American Civil War, even liberals like John Stuart Mill, they understood that American democracy was not the model for the future. It was they thought tyranny of the majority, and they attributed that to Tocqueville. Incorrectly, I would argue. But they saw democracy as inherently fragile and given to collapse, and it would descend into anarchy or tyranny, and that's what they expected. And every time that Lincoln locked someone up in Maryland, and so on, they said, "Here it is, despotism, the American Bastille," and so on. But that's not what happened. And I think at the end of the war, people marveled that Lincoln not only ruled according to the rule of law, but that he stood for election in the middle of a crisis like this. And when he died, too, I think that the reverence for him uh, really buoyed the respect for democracy as a form of government or a principle for government, whether it was a monarchy or a constitutional monarchy or a true democracy, a pure republic. The 1860s were a real turning point for the United States, for all of the American hemisphere, and for much of Western Europe. And it wouldn't stop then. It was an unending blaze.
Yeah, I like that phrase. The unending blaze makes me think of Jonathan Israel's book, the expanding blaze. So that's what we were.
Yes,
Good.
yeah, we're on the same page.
No, that's a wonderful book. And of course, in Mexico, they take the viceroy, and he's eventually killed, and that itself sends a shockwave.
Yeah, and if Lincoln's assassination increased the reverence for him and for democracy, Maximilian's execution just sent a chill of doom through European courts and through every throne in Europe.
So next year is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and I suppose this is the last day of 2025 that I can phrase the question in that way to a guest. Next time I'll be saying this year, but next year, how does the history that you explore in the Cause of All Nations connect, you think, to the Declaration of Independence? And if one wanted to sort of see that anniversary through the lens of your book and this history, what do you think that might look like?
Well, many historians have referred to the American Civil War as the Second American Revolution. It was a term that Thaddeus Stevens also used during Reconstruction. And the idea was that they were finally fulfilling some of the basic principles of the revolution that were stymied, blockaded, obstructed by the slave states. And that was the end of slavery and human equality for all. And that the Civil War was caused by a kind of anti-republican malignancy that had been allowed to grow up on the foundations of slavery, a slave-holding aristocracy that had corrupted the republic. And so Reconstruction intended to rid the country, the nation, of the cause of the rebellion, and also kind of flatten the the social hierarchy that had given this aristocracy, this anti-democratic, anti-republican aristocracy, so much power. The idea of it was to fulfill the revolution and its ideals, and I think they were very much tied, those radical Republicans, to the ideals of the revolution, to Tom Paine's voice. And I think it's good to see these two events as the first founding and then the second founding. constitutional amendments that expanded the rights of humans during Reconstruction. And I think historians have mourned the failure of Reconstruction to continue and to be sustained. But it's still there. It may not be the expanding blaze, but it is the kind of the eternal blaze that we go back to and try to revive. And I think a lot of people are feeling that this is a good time to be reminded of that and to remember our founding, but also our second founding in the 1860s.
Well, Don, I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation with us about the history that you present in this book. I do intend to reach out again so that we can talk about
That'd be
the
great. Yeah,
sequel. That
we
would
can
that
do
would
it.
that would be wonderful, and really encourage folks to read this book. It really changed my perspective and some sort of assumptions that I realized I'd picked up about the war, and it does what you set out to do, which it expands the context of what's going on and presents the Civil War as it was such an international event. So a really great book in that way.
Thank you so much, Luke. I really enjoyed it.